The auctioneer's gavel struck the wooden podium with a crack that split the dry August air of Caldwell, Kansas, and Lavinia Whitaker stood on that raised platform in the summer of 1878, with her chin lifted so high that not a single soul in that crowd could mistake her dignity for defeat, even as everything she had ever known was being stripped away from her one bid at a time. She had arrived in Caldwell 3 days earlier with nothing more than the clothes on her back, a small carpet bag containing a hairbrush, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and the bay mare named Duchess, who had been her only companion across 400 miles of open prairie. The journey itself had been a catastrophe born from the ashes of a life that had collapsed so suddenly and so completely that she still struggled to believe any of it was real. Her father, Elias Whitaker, had been a cattle rancher of modest but honest means in the Texas Panhandle, a man who had built something real from nothing, who had loved his land and his daughter with equal fierceness. He had died in the spring, taken by a fever that moved through the ranch like wildfire through dry grass, and what Lavinia had discovered in the weeks following his death had shattered whatever remained of her sense of safety. Her father had borrowed heavily against the ranch during a terrible drought 2 winters past, borrowing from a man named Clement Ford, who ran a lending operation out of Amarillo that was only barely distinguishable from organized theft. The debt had grown with interest rates that were criminal in spirit if not in the letter of any law that would bother to notice, and when Lavinia had gone to Clement Ford herself, dressed in her best calico dress with every document her father had ever signed laid out before her, Ford had smiled at her in a way that made her skin crawl and told her the ranch, the cattle, the equipment, and anything else of value would be taken as settlement. She had ridden out of Texas on Duchess with $43 tucked into the lining of her boot, heading north toward Kansas because she had heard there was honest work to be found in the cattle towns, because the drovers needed cooks and laundresses and women who could run boarding houses, and because north was simply the direction that felt the most like escape. She was 24 years old. She had a solid education her mother had insisted upon before dying of typhoid when Lavinia was 11. She could cook and sew and keep accounts, and she had believed, with the particular stubborn optimism of a person who has never before been truly broken, that she would find her footing. What she had not anticipated was the men who had followed her from Amarillo. Ford had sent 2 of his collection agents after her, men named Ruddy Breck and Cal Simons, on the grounds that Lavinia had taken Duchess without his permission, since the horse had technically been part of the ranch property that was now his. They had caught up with her 2 days outside of Caldwell, and though they had not harmed her physically, they had made it absolutely clear that the horse was coming with them, and so was whatever money she was carrying, which they claimed was also technically Ford's property given that her father had owed the debt. She had argued, she had pleaded, and when neither of those worked she had simply stared at them with those dark eyes that her father had always said could cut through stone, and Ruddy Breck had stared back at her and said words that still burned in her memory like a brand. He had said that Ford had another proposal, that a woman alone in Kansas with no money, no land, and no family was a problem waiting to happen, and that Ford was a generous man who believed in solutions. There was a house in Caldwell, a certain kind of house that a certain kind of woman might find a place in, and Ford's man in Caldwell, a fellow named Deacon Pruitt, ran a discreet and profitable establishment. She had not said a word. She had simply turned Duchess and ridden hard for Caldwell because she had decided, in that terrible crystalline moment of clarity, that she would rather face whatever was waiting in a town than whatever was following her on the open prairie. But Ruddy Breck and Cal Simons had got to Caldwell before her, or rather they had ridden a faster route and arrived ahead of her, and by the time Lavinia had stabled Duchess at the livery and spent her last $2 on a room at the least offensive of the town's 3 hotels, Deacon Pruitt already knew she was coming and had already begun the paperwork. She had not known what the paperwork was until the town marshal, a hollow-eyed man named Taggart who owed Prout a great deal of money for reasons that nobody discussed openly, had knocked on her door the second morning and told her she had been named in a debt collection proceeding and would be required to appear before the magistrate. The magistrate, she discovered, was a man who had ridden into Caldwell 6 months earlier and set himself up with an impressive amount of official-sounding furniture and a total absence of any actual legal authority. But in a cattle town in 1878, the difference between law and the performance of law was a distinction most people could not afford to make. The proceeding had lasted 20 minutes. Deacon Prout had presented a document that claimed her father had borrowed money not just from Clement Ford but from Prout himself, a separate loan, which was a complete fabrication, but one supported by 2 witnesses who had been paid to remember it, and the outcome had been determined before she walked into the room. The judge had ruled that the debt was valid, that her horse and all her possessions were to be considered assets, and that since the debt exceeded those assets, she herself, as the inheriting party, was subject to an indenture proceeding under a statute that Lavinia was fairly certain had never existed anywhere outside of this man's imagination. She had stood in that room and felt the floor shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with the world. The auction had been announced for the following morning in the town square, and Lavinia had spent that night sitting on the edge of the narrow hotel bed with her mother's Bible in her lap, not reading it, just holding it, feeling the worn leather cover beneath her fingers and thinking about what it meant to be a woman alone in a country that had not yet decided what women were worth. She had not cried. She had told herself she would not cry, and she had kept that promise with a ferocity that cost her something, though she would not have been able to name exactly what. The morning of the auction had arrived with a sky so blue and indifferent that it felt like an insult, and Lavinia had walked to the town square in her calico dress with her chin lifted and her hands quiet at her sides, and she had climbed the 3 steps to the platform when the marshal had told her to, and she had stood there while Deacon Prout, in his good gray suit and his careful smile, had addressed the small crowd that had gathered. There were perhaps 30 people watching. A few curious townspeople who had nothing better to do. Several men who worked for the various cattle operations that moved through Caldwell in the summer months. A pair of women from what Lavinia now understood was Prout's establishment, standing at the edge of the crowd with expressions that mixed sympathy and resignation in equal parts, which told Lavinia more about what this outcome was expected to be than anything else. Prout had started the bidding with a speech about indenture and debt settlement that dressed the entire obscenity in the language of legality, and then he had gestured toward Lavinia and said she came with a horse, a fine bay mare, and that the combined bid would cover the outstanding debt and provide the winning bidder with a period of service commensurate with the balance. The bids had started low, discouragingly low. Lavinia had known, in some abstract and terrible way, that she was being valued less than the horse beneath her, and the knowledge had sat in her chest like a stone. The bidding had moved in small, disinterested increments, the kind of increments that spoke to how little anyone in that crowd believed there was anything here worth competing over. And then a man had walked out of the morning crowd with the unhurried stride of someone who had not been there a moment ago and was now entirely present, and he had stopped at the edge of the platform and looked up at her, and he had asked for a pause in the bidding. Prout had not liked that. His smile had thinned, and he had told the man that the bidding was in progress and interruptions were not part of the process. The man had ignored him with the calm efficiency of someone who had long ago decided which voices deserved his attention and which did not. He had looked directly at Lavinia, not at her dress or her figure or the horse that had been led out alongside the platform, but at her face, and he had said, in a voice that was low and level and carried across the square without effort, "What is your name, ma'am? Not what is she worth? Not what does she cook?" not whether she was docile or difficult or any of the dozen other assessments that had been murmured through the crowd all morning. Just her name. Lavinia had stared at him for a moment that felt longer than it was, and something in her chest had shifted, not dramatically, not with any particular warmth yet, but with the subtle adjustment of a compass needle finding north. "Lavinia Whitaker," she had said, and her voice had come out clear and steady, and she had been so surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, that it had almost undone her. The man had nodded, as if this was exactly the answer he needed, and exactly what he expected from a woman standing on a platform in a blue dress with her chin lifted against the humiliation of everything. He had turned back to Prout and bid $230, which was more than anyone else had bid, more than the horse itself had drawn, and which effectively ended the auction in a single motion. Prout had tried to protest. He had said the bidding was still open, that proper procedure required 3 calls, and the man had reached into his coat, produced a leather fold of bills, counted them out onto the edge of the platform with deliberate patience, and said that if Prout wanted to discuss proper procedure, they could discuss it down at the telegraph office while they waited for a reply from the territorial marshal's office in Wichita. Because the man had sent a wire the previous evening describing the nature of this auction and the legal grounds on which it claimed to be based, the silence that followed had been remarkable. Prout's smile had not changed, but his eyes had, and after a moment he had swept the bills off the platform edge and announced the auction closed. The man who had bought her freedom for $230, which was $40 less than Duchess had been worth on a good day, had turned back to Lavinia and held out his hand to help her down from the platform, and she had looked at that hand for just a second before taking it. His name, she would learn in the first 5 minutes of their acquaintance, was Graham Haskins. He was 31 years old, though he looked both younger and older than that in alternating moments, and he was tall without being imposing, broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had done physical work all his life without making it his identity. He had brown hair that needed cutting and gray eyes the color of rain over open country, and he had a face that was weathered but not hardened, which was a distinction Lavinia would come to understand better over time. There was a difference between a man the land had marked and a man the land had ruined, and Graham Haskins fell firmly on the right side of that line. He had led her away from the platform and away from the thinning crowd and away from Prout's careful eyes, and he had not spoken until they were standing in the narrow shade of the livery stable doorway, and then he had said, "I want to be clear about what this arrangement is and what it is not." Lavinia had looked at him steadily. She had braced herself for any number of things, because a man did not spend $230 on a woman without expecting something in return, and whatever he was about to say, she had made a quiet private promise to herself that she would hear it all the way through before she decided how to respond. "It is not what Prout intended it to be," Graham had said. "The proceeding he ran this morning was not legal, and both of us know it. I spoke with an actual attorney in Wichita 3 weeks ago about a different matter, and he described exactly this kind of arrangement and used the word fraud without hesitation." He had paused. "What it is, Miss Whitaker, if you are agreeable, is temporary employment. I have a ranch east of here, the Dry Fall, about 40 miles. I run cattle. I need a cook and someone who can keep the accounts, because my current method of keeping accounts is a biscuit tin full of receipts that I address once a year, and it is not working." Lavinia had waited. "You would have your own room," he had continued, with the slightly awkward precision of a man making sure he was being understood correctly. "Wages, $30 a month, which is what I pay my foreman, and I mention that only so you understand I am not valuing your work below his." He had looked at her directly. "Your horse is yours. The moment we are off Prout's claimed jurisdiction, the horse is yours and no one will tell you otherwise." There had been something so carefully constructed about the offer, so deliberate in its effort to be decent, that Lavinia had found herself in the strange position of having to decide whether to trust it. And the thing about Graham Haskins, she would realize later, was that he had made it easy to trust him not by being effusive or charming or insistent, but by being utterly matter-of-fact about the whole business, as if decency were simply the most practical approach and required no particular celebration. Why? She had asked. He had considered the question seriously, which was another thing she would come to appreciate about him. He did not brush off serious questions. "Because I watched that proceeding for 20 minutes before I walked up," he had said, "and I have a mother and 2 sisters, and I would want someone to do the same for any of them. And because your horse looked at me with more intelligence than anyone else in that square, and I thought that probably said something about its owner." Lavinia had almost smiled. She had stopped it before it fully formed, but the impulse had been there, real and surprising, which, given the morning she had just experienced, was something close to remarkable. $30 a month, she had said. "And your horse?" "Yes," she had said. "I will take the arrangement." They had left Caldwell within the hour, Lavinia on Duchess and Graham on his own horse, a sturdy roan gelding he called Anchor, and Deacon Prout had watched them go from the doorway of his establishment, with an expression that combined calculation with the grudging acknowledgement of a man who has lost a particular hand, but not the game. Graham had not looked back. Lavinia had once, and she had held Prout's gaze for exactly 1 second before turning away, because she wanted him to know she was not afraid, and because she wanted herself to know it too. The ride to the Dryfall took most of 2 days, and during those 2 days, Lavinia learned things about Graham Haskins in the unhurried way that long rides permit, through the accumulated weight of small details rather than any single revelation. She learned that he had come to Kansas from Missouri in 1871, that he had worked on 2 other ranches before he had saved enough to buy the Dryfall property, that the name came from a dry creek that bisected the northern pasture, and which apparently filled with water twice a year, with a reliability that had initially fooled him into thinking it was permanent. She learned that he had a foreman named Eli Voss who had been with him for 4 years, that he ran about 300 head of Longhorn and was trying to slowly introduce Shorthorn bloodlines because he believed the market was shifting toward beef quality rather than trail hardiness, and that he read when he got the chance, which was not as often as he would like. She did not tell him everything about herself. Not yet. She told him about her father's ranch in Texas and the drought and the debt, and she told him about Clement Ford and the way the whole machinery of dispossession had operated, and she watched his face while she talked and saw the careful, controlled anger that moved through it, the kind of anger that belongs to a person who understands injustice clearly, but has learned that rage without direction is only destruction wearing different clothes. "Ford is still operating in Amarillo?" he asked. "As far as I know," she said, "and Prout was his man in Caldwell. That was the impression I received." Graham had been quiet for a moment, watching the horizon. "There are men like Ford in every territory," he said finally. "They use the machinery of law as a weapon against people who don't have the resources to fight back, and they do it because it works." He paused. "It doesn't always keep working." It was not a threat. It was simply an observation about the long arc of consequences, and Lavinia had found it oddly comforting, the way a statement of natural truth is comforting even when the truth itself is slow. The Dryfall had surprised her. She had prepared herself for modest and found something that was, in its own particular way, beautiful. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built from local limestone, and it sat at the crest of a gentle rise that gave it a view of the surrounding grassland in 3 directions. And in the late afternoon light of that first arrival, the grass had been gold, and the sky had been enormous, and Lavinia had stood at the rail of the front porch while Graham saw to the horses, and had felt, for the first time in months, that she was standing on ground that might hold her weight. Eli Voss had met them on the porch, a compact, dark-bearded man of perhaps 40 who regarded Lavinia with a frank, assessing look that was entirely professional, and then nodded once, which she understood to be his equivalent of a full endorsement. He had showed her the kitchen, which was large and well-equipped by the standards she had grown up with, and the accounts room, which was small and contained the famous biscuit tin Graham had mentioned, which turned out to be less a tin and more a wooden crate, and which was so comprehensively disordered that Lavinia had looked at it for a full moment in silence before deciding that this was actually an interesting problem rather than an overwhelming one. Her room was upstairs, clean and private, with a window that looked east over the pasture and a quilt on the narrow bed that had clearly been made by someone who knew what they were doing. She had set her carpetbag on the chair by the window and her mother's Bible on the small table beside the bed, and she had stood for a moment in the particular quiet of a space that was hers, and she had pressed both hands flat against the cool, plastered wall and breathed. The first week at the dryfall was one of discovery and careful calibration. Lavinia learned the rhythms of the ranch, the hours the hands kept, the particular appetites of 6 men who spent 10 hours a day in the open air and returned hungry enough to eat the furniture. She learned that 2 of the ranch hands, brothers named Pete and Orrin Creel, were entertaining in the specific way of people who have spent so much time together that they have developed their own private language of argument, and that observing it was essentially a form of theater. She learned that Eli Voss was a man of deep competence and absolute loyalty who had opinions about everything, but expressed them only when asked, and then with a frankness that was bracing and oddly refreshing. And she learned, gradually and then more thoroughly, that the accounts were not merely disorganized but actively misleading, in the sense that Graham had been significantly undercharging for certain contracted beef deliveries, because he had not been tracking the current market price and had simply been renewing agreements at the previous year's rate. She had spent 3 days with the crate of receipts and an accounts ledger she had found in the desk, and by the end of those 3 days, she had a clear picture of the dryfall's finances that was considerably healthier than Graham had believed it to be, and also considerably healthier than it needed to be if he continued accepting the old rates. She had presented this to him on the 4th evening at the kitchen table, the ledger open between them, and he had looked at her work with an expression that moved from polite interest to genuine surprise to something that might have been embarrassment at his own carelessness. And then he had looked at her and said, with a directness that she had already identified as one of his defining characteristics, "You have just found me $200 I didn't know I had." "You have not lost it," she had clarified. "You simply were not collecting it. You will need to renegotiate 3 of your delivery agreements before the fall drive." "I know the men I need to renegotiate with," he had said. "One of them has been trading on our friendship and I have been too polite to notice." He had closed the ledger carefully. "Thank you, Miss Whitaker." The formality of the address had started to feel strange to her by then, not unwelcome exactly, but slightly out of step with the reality of 2 people sitting at a kitchen table going over accounts in the lamplight, and she had said, before she quite decided to, "Lavinia." He had looked up at her. "You can call me Lavinia," she had said. "Miss Whitaker makes me feel like I am being introduced at a church social." The corners of his mouth had moved. "Then you should call me Graham," he had said. "Because I wore out my good manners in that church social sometime around 1875. That had made her laugh, actually laugh, the first genuine unguarded laugh she had produced in what felt like a very long time, and the sound of it had surprised her almost as much as it seemed to surprise him, and they had both sat with it for a moment before she had reached for the ledger again, and they had gone back to the accounts. But something had shifted in that moment, quietly and without announcement, and Lavinia had felt it and had noted it, and had then deliberately put it aside because she was a practical woman who understood that gratitude and relief could masquerade as other feelings, and she had no intention of mistaking one for the other. The weeks passed, and the dryfall became familiar to her in the way that places do when you move through them daily and leave small marks of your presence on them. A jar of dried herbs on the kitchen shelf, a new system for the accounts that replaced the crate with properly labeled ledger books, a kitchen garden she had started in the plot beside the south wall where the light was best. The work suited her. She had always been a person who needed to be useful, who found a particular satisfaction in the visible evidence of effort. And here the evidence was everywhere, in the meals that came out of that kitchen, in the accounts that now balanced cleanly and told a coherent story, in the garden that was slow but definite. She rode Duchess every morning before the heat settled, out along the eastern pasture fence and back, and sometimes Graham rode out in the same direction on Anchor, and they would fall into pace beside each other without particular arrangement, and those rides became one of the daily things she found herself looking forward to, which she also noted, and also deliberately set aside. He was not a man who spoke for the sake of speaking, and she was not a woman who required that. They could ride for 20 minutes in companionable silence, which was a kind of communication in itself, a mutual acknowledgement that the other person's presence was comfortable rather than demanding. And in Lavinia's experience, that kind of ease was rarer and more valuable than a great deal of eloquent conversation. When he did talk, he talked about the land and the cattle and the things he was planning, the improvements to the eastern pasture fence, the question of whether to add a small dairy operation, the news from the cattle markets in Wichita that Eli Voss brought back from his twice-monthly supply runs. And sometimes he talked about his family in Missouri, his mother who had taught school for 30 years and who wrote him letters in a hand so precise it looked like typeset, his sister Clara who had married a farmer and was relentlessly practical and funny about it, his younger sister Me who was 17 and full of opinions about everything. He had asked about her family carefully, in the way of someone who knew there was loss there, and was not treating it as a casual subject. She had told him about her father, about the ranch in Texas and the particular quality of her father's laugh, which had been too big for the man who produced it, a joyful, undignified sound that he had never seemed embarrassed by. She had told him about her mother, who she had lost too early to have known well but who lived in her memory as a series of specific, vivid images, hands that moved quickly over fabric, a singing voice that was not technically good but entirely sincere, the smell of lavender on the pillow where she had slept. Graham had listened to all of it with the complete attention of someone who understood that being heard was not a passive act but an active one, and Lavinia had found herself saying more than she had planned to say, and then not minding that she had. It was in the 5th week that she had first noticed, undeniably and without the ability to reassign it to anything more convenient, that she was not simply grateful to him. Gratitude, she understood. Gratitude was clean and definable, and it did not do what this feeling did, which was to make the back of her neck warm when he walked into a room she was already in, and to make her more aware of her own voice when she was speaking to him, and to cause her to spend a frankly unreasonable amount of time remembering the specific way he had said her name that first morning in the town square. She was not a woman given to romantic fantasy. Her upbringing had been practical, and her experience of the world had made it more so, and she had watched enough women mistake dependency for love and circumstance for destiny to have developed a healthy skepticism about her own emotional responses. She examined this feeling the way she would examine a suspect column of figures, looking for where the numbers had been inflated, where something had been added that did not belong, where wishful thinking had gotten in among the facts. But the numbers kept coming out the same way. She liked him. She liked him specifically and particularly, and not in the general way she might like anyone who had been decent to her in a moment of vulnerability, but in the way you like a person whose particular qualities you have had time to observe and assess and find genuinely admirable. She liked his steadiness, which was not passivity but rather a kind of rooted confidence that did not need to assert itself loudly. She liked the way he was with his men, which was fair and direct and without condescension, and the way his men responded to this, which was with the kind of loyalty that cannot be bought and can only be earned over time. She liked the way he handled disappointment, which happened regularly on a working cattle ranch, with a calm practicality that looked for solutions rather than someone to blame. She liked, more than she felt entirely comfortable admitting, that he had asked her name first. In a world that had shown her, with considerable force and clarity, exactly what value it assigned to a woman alone, the simple act of asking her name before anything else had lodged itself in her chest like a key finding a lock that had been waiting for it for a long time. The revelation came for Graham in a different way, and at a different moment, though he had been moving toward it, he would later admit, from considerably earlier than he recognized at the time. It came on a Thursday afternoon in the 6th week, when a summer storm had rolled in from the northwest with the sudden, operatic ferocity that the Kansas plains specialized in, and Lavinia had been in the south pasture checking on the condition of the garden stakes she had placed the previous week, when the sky had turned the particular shade of green-black that meant serious weather was coming fast. Graham had ridden out to find her before any of his hands could, which was information in itself, and they had ridden hard back to the house together, with the wind picking up behind them, and the first wall of rain visible on the horizon like a gray curtain being drawn across the world. They had reached the barn just as the rain hit, and they had both been laughing by the time they dismounted, laughing at the sheer sudden violence of the weather and the indignity of being slightly wet and the adrenaline of the fast ride. And they had stood in the barn doorway watching the rain come down in sheets and the lightning play across the distance, and Lavinia had been standing close enough that he could smell the rain in her hair. And she had turned to say something, and whatever it was had gone out of her mind completely because he was looking at her, not at the storm, at her. She had held his gaze for a moment that lasted several heartbeats too long to be accidental, and then the thunder had cracked close enough to make Duchess shift in her stall, and they had both looked away, and Graham had said something entirely sensible about the fence line in the north pasture and whether it would hold, and Lavinia had said something equally sensible about supper. And they had both retreated into the practical business of the evening, with a speed that suggested they were both aware of what had just happened, and had both independently decided that now was not the moment to address it. But the moment had happened. It had weight and substance, and it did not go away simply because they chose not to look directly at it. Eli Voss, who had the particular perceptiveness of a man who spends a great deal of time watching people work together without engaging in much conversation himself, noticed all of this with the expression of a person watching a slow process arrive at an inevitable conclusion. He did not say anything. This was consistent with his general approach to life. It was in the 7th week that the matter of Deacon Prout returned, which was the thing that moved everything from the careful and unacknowledged to the urgent and unavoidable. A rider came to the dryfall on a Wednesday morning, a young man named Eddie Marsh who worked as a message carrier for the Caldwell post office, and he brought 2 pieces of news. The first was a letter from the territorial marshal's office in Wichita confirming that they had received Graham's wire and had opened an inquiry into the practices of one Deacon Prout and the proceedings he had been conducting in Caldwell under fraudulent legal authority. The second was a warning, delivered verbally by Eddie with the wide-eyed gravity of a young man who understood he was carrying something important, that Prout had sent men to ask questions about the whereabouts of Lavinia Whitaker, and that the 2 men asking the questions had been identified as Ruddy Breck and Cal Simons. Graham had read the letter and listened to Eddie's account and thanked the young man and paid him fairly and sent him on his way. And then he had stood on the porch for a moment with the letter in his hand, and the kind of expression he wore when he was thinking through a problem from multiple angles simultaneously. When Lavinia came out with coffee and found him standing there, he had told her directly. He was not the kind of man who managed information on a woman's behalf as if she were too fragile to receive it, which she already knew and was grateful for. She had listened to everything, and then she had been quiet for a moment, looking out at the grassland, and she had said, Prute is Ford's man. If Prute is in trouble, Ford will want to resolve it before the inquiry gains any footing. Ruddy Breck and Cal Simons are not looking for me because they are concerned about my welfare. No, Graham had agreed. What is the range of outcomes here? She had asked. He had looked at her with something that was close to admiration. Most people, when they were frightened, either overclaimed their composure or lost it entirely. Lavinia Whitaker apparently responded to fear by asking the right questions, which was a quality he found extraordinarily useful, and if he was honest with himself, something that he found deeply attractive. Breck and Simons come here and cause trouble, he said. Breck and Simons go back to Amarillo because they decide the inquiry makes the situation too complicated, or Ford himself decides the inquiry is a sufficient deterrent and withdraws. What is most likely? Ford is the kind of man who does not abandon a position without testing it first, Graham said. I think Breck and Simons come here. Lavinia had nodded slowly. Then we should be prepared for that. There had been no we in the dry fall before that moment that was not simply the general we of a ranch operation, the collective we of work and function. The we she had just used was specific and deliberate, and they had both heard it, and Graham had looked at her with that careful steadiness of his and said, yes, we should. He had spoken to Eli Voss that afternoon and to the Creel brothers and to the two other hands, men named Sam Holt and Wes Dunbar, and the arrangements that were made were not violent in nature, but were thorough in a way that made violence unnecessary. The Dry Falls situation was communicated to the neighboring ranches through the efficient network of riders and shared water sources that made up the informal communication system of the territory, and several ranchers who had their own reasons to dislike Clement Ford's operations sent word that they would be available if called. Graham sent another wire to Wichita, this one more specific, naming Breck and Simons and their probable destination. Breck and Simons arrived on a Friday, riding in at midday with the particular swagger of men who are accustomed to their presence being sufficient intimidation. They were not expecting 6 men and a woman all engaged in entirely ordinary ranch work, who simply stopped what they were doing and watched them ride into the yard with a collective, unhurried attention that was considerably more unnerving than any displayed weapon. Ruddy Breck had demanded to speak to the owner. Graham had come down from the porch without hurry, and the conversation that followed had been brief and remarkable for its complete absence of anything resembling threat or drama. Graham had explained, in the tone of someone reviewing established facts, that the matter of Miss Lavinia Whitaker's supposed debt had been the subject of a formal inquiry by the Territorial Marshal's office, that the proceedings under which she had been subjected to auction had been identified as fraudulent, and that any further action against her person or her property would be added to the list of matters under inquiry. He had handed Ruddy Breck a copy of the Wichita letter with the calm efficiency of a man who had prepared for this moment. He had then mentioned, without particular drama, the number of neighboring ranches whose owners had expressed interest in the outcome of this situation. Breck had looked at the letter and at Graham and at the assembled ranch hands and at Lavinia, who was standing near the barn doorway with her arms crossed and her chin at the particular angle that had been her first identifiable characteristic. And then he had said something to Cal Simons in a low voice, and they had both ridden out the way they came without another word. The collective exhale of the ranch yard had been almost audible. Eli Voss had said with great dignity, "I'll put the coffee on," and had gone into the house. Lavinia had stood for a moment after everyone dispersed, and then she had walked to where Graham was still standing, and she had looked at him for a long moment, and what she had been about to say, she was not entirely sure, because what came out was not the practical or the measured but simply, quietly, "Thank you." He had looked at her and he had said just as quietly, "You don't have to thank me for that." "I know," she had said. "I am thanking you anyway." They had stood there in the warm midday air of the ranch yard, with the horses moving in the paddock, and the sound of Eli making coffee inside, and the grassland stretching away in every direction under the bright Kansas sky. And the feeling between them had been so large and so clearly defined that it had been almost startling that neither of them had moved yet. And then Graham had said, in a voice that was lower than his usual speaking voice, "Lavinia," just her name, again. Just as it had been the first time, in the square in Caldwell, except that this time it was not a question or a practical inquiry but something else entirely, and she had known exactly what it was. She had said, "I know." He had taken a breath. "I am not going to pretend that things are simple," he said, and she could see the effort he was making to be precise, to be fair, to not put any weight on a situation that she had not invited. "You came here under circumstances that gave you limited choices, and I don't want you to feel, Graham," she said. He stopped. "I am a woman of 24 who has crossed 400 miles of open country alone, and stood on an auction block in a public square and ridden out with a stranger, and managed your accounts, and started a kitchen garden and read 3 of your books, and had enough conversations with you in the past 7 weeks to form a very clear opinion of your character." She held his gaze steadily. "I am not confusing gratitude with anything else. I am not making a decision under pressure. I am telling you, as clearly as I know how to tell you anything, that I have feelings for you that are genuine and specific and nothing to do with the circumstances under which we met. And if you have something similar to say, I would like you to say it." The expression that moved through Graham Haskins' face during that speech was one that she would remember for the rest of her life, the particular movement from careful restraint to something that was entirely unguarded, the expression of a man who has been carrying something with great effort and has just been told he is allowed to put it down. "I have something similar to say," he said. "Then say it." "I love you," he said. "I think I have been moving in that direction since you said your name in Caldwell, and I am absolutely certain of it now." The silence between them was warm and complete, the kind of silence that is not absence but presence. "I love you too," Lavinia said. "I have been extremely practical about it, and it has not helped at all." That made him laugh, the same quality of laugh she had produced from him before, genuine and unguarded, and he reached out and took her hand, and the warmth of his hand around hers was so immediately right that she thought it should probably have surprised her more than it did. Eli Voss, passing through the kitchen window at that moment, noted the scene in the yard with complete satisfaction and continued making coffee. The weeks that followed were different in a way that everyone on the Dryfall felt without needing to name it. The ranch was the same, the work was the same, the rhythms of the days were the same, but there was a current running through all of it that had not been there before, a warmth in the ordinary movement of two people sharing a space who have acknowledged that the space they are sharing matters to both of them. Graham and Lavinia did not rush toward anything. They were both, by nature and by the education of their respective experiences, cautious with things that mattered, and what was developing between them mattered considerably. Their evenings became a particular kind of ritual, the work of the day done, the supper cleared, the ranch quiet, and the two of them at the kitchen table or on the porch, talking about everything and nothing with the leisurely pleasure of people who have discovered in each other a genuine companion. He told her more about Missouri, about the particular quality of his childhood which had been modest and hardworking and loving in the unsentimental way of farming families, where love was expressed primarily through action and presence, and the quiet showing up of day after day. He told her about why he had come west, which was not the romantic impulse of adventure but the practical one of space, the knowledge that in Missouri the land was spoken for, and in Kansas there was still the possibility of something that belonged to you, and how that possibility had felt like oxygen. She told him about the years between her mother's death and her father's, the years of learning to be useful, of taking on the running of the ranch house when she was 11 and 12 and 13, with a competence that she had been quietly proud of of the particular loneliness of being the only child in a house that was full of men's work and open sky. She told him about the books she had ordered through the mail, the novels and the natural history texts and the almanacs, about the conversations she had had with her father on the porch after supper that had ranged across every subject she could think of, because Elias Whitaker had believed that his daughter's mind was worth developing and had acted on that belief every day of his life. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Graham said one evening. "He was," she said. "He was not complicated. He just knew what was right and did it." "That is more rare than it sounds," Graham said. "I know," she said. "I found that out in Amarillo." He had reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she had turned her hand over to hold his, and they had sat like that in the lamplight with the night sounds of the Kansas summer coming through the open window, and neither of them had needed to say anything else. In October, a letter arrived from Wichita. The territorial marshal's office had completed its inquiry into the practices of Deacon Pruitt and had determined that the auctions he had been conducting were fraudulent in every respect, that the legal authority he had been representing was entirely fabricated, and that Pruitt himself had been arrested. Furthermore, the investigation had expanded to include Clement Ford's lending practices in Amarillo, and the Texas authorities had been notified. The letter noted, with official formality, that any proceedings conducted by Pruitt under his false authority were null and void, and that any persons subjected to such proceedings were to be considered free of any obligations arising from them. Graham had read the letter aloud at the supper table, and when he finished there had been a moment of complete quiet, and then Eli Voss had raised his coffee cup and said, "Seems right," and Pete Creel had said something to his brother in their private language and they had both nodded, and Lavinia had sat very still for a moment with her hands in her lap, and then she had said, in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely clear, "Good." It was a small word for a large thing, but it was the right word. The machinery of injustice had, in this particular instance and against considerable odds, been interrupted by the machinery of actual law. And while Lavinia understood clearly that this was not always how it went, that in 100 other cases it went differently, it had gone right this time, and that mattered. That evening, after supper, she had gone out to the barn and spent a long time with Duchess, her hand moving over the mare's neck in the slow, rhythmic way that was both comfort and communication, and she had thought about her father, and about the ranch in Texas, and about the particular road that had brought her here, to this barn, on this clear October night. With the stars enormous overhead, and the smell of hay and horse around her, and a man in the house whose specific and genuine love for her was something she held as carefully as she held her mother's Bible. Graham had found her there, not because he had followed her but because he had seen from the window that she had gone to the barn and had understood without needing to ask, that there was something in the letter that needed a little space to be processed, and that she might not want to process it entirely alone. He had leaned on the stall gate beside her and been quiet, which was his gift, the ability to be present without being intrusive. After a while she had said, "I wish my father could have seen this." "Tell me what he would have said," Graham had replied. She had thought about it. "He would have said that the law is slow but it is not completely blind," she said. He believed in that. He believed that systems could be corrupt and still contain the seeds of their own correction if you were patient enough and loud enough for long enough. She paused. "I was not always sure he was right. I'm a little more sure now." "He sounds like a man who knew something about keeping faith," Graham said. "He did," she said. "He kept it with everything." She had looked at Graham then in the dim barn light and she had said with the directness that was one of the things he loved most about her, "He would have liked you." Graham had been quiet for a moment. "I would have tried to deserve that." She had reached up and kissed him, the first time she had initiated it, standing in the hay-scented barn with her mare watching them with wise, dark eyes, and he had kissed her back with a tenderness that was entirely consistent with everything she had come to know about him, thorough and unhurried and real. November brought the first hard frost, and with it a different quality to the days, the compressed, purposeful bustle of a ranch preparing for winter. The cattle moved to the closer pastures, the feed stores assessed, the equipment checked and repaired. Lavinia had organized the winter provisions with the same systematic competence she had brought to everything else, and the result was a root cellar and dry store that Eli Voss regarded with visible approval, and the Creel brothers regarded with the warm anticipation of men who understood that good organization meant better eating through February. It was during this period that Graham had asked her to marry him. He had not made a production of it. He was not a man given to production. They had been on the porch in the cold, clear evening after the rest of the household had turned in, sitting in the wooden chairs with a blanket over their laps and the stars brilliant and numerous overhead, and he had turned to her in the half-dark and said, with the directness that was simply how he talked, "I would like to marry you, Lavinia, if you are willing." She had looked at the stars for a moment, not to consider the question, but simply because the stars were remarkable and she was a person who noticed remarkable things. Then she had said, "Yes, I am very willing." He had exhaled slowly, and she had heard in that exhale the quiet release of a man who had been holding something very carefully for a long time, and she had turned and found him looking at her with an expression so entirely open and unguarded that it caught her breath. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I have been trying to calculate when I could get to Wichita without the ranch suffering for it, and I have not solved that problem yet." "I don't need a ring," she said. "You will have one," he said. "But not yet, Graham," she said. "I am sitting on a porch in Kansas in November with a blanket over my lap and the best view of any sky I have ever seen, and a man I love asking me to marry him. I have everything I need." He had taken her hand under the blanket and held it, and they had sat there for another hour in the cold and the starlight, talking about the things that lay ahead, and the conversation had had the quality of a door opening onto a long and spacious room, full of light and possibility and all the particular joy of two people who have found, against the considerable odds of the world they inhabit, exactly the right person. They were married in December, in the main room of the Dryfall house, with Eli Voss and the Creel brothers and Sam Holt and Wes Dunbar as witnesses, and a circuit preacher named Brother Calloway, who made the rounds of the outlying ranches every 8 weeks and who was, fortuitously, on his regular schedule. Lavinia wore the best dress she had, which was a deep green wool she had sewn herself from fabric she had ordered from Wichita in October, and Graham wore his good coat and had actually gotten his hair cut, which Eli Voss had noted with an expression that was as close to sentimental as he ever came. Brother Calloway performed the ceremony with the straightforward warmth of a man who had been doing this in ranch houses and on open ground for 20 years and had never lost his appreciation for it. And when he asked them to speak their vows, Graham had looked at Lavinia with an expression so entirely steady and sure that she had felt it settle into her like sunlight. And she had spoken her own vows in return, with a clarity and conviction that came from somewhere in the center of herself that did not waver. Pete Creel cried, which surprised everyone including Pete Creel, and Orrin handed him a handkerchief with the serene matter-of-factness of a brother who has been performing exactly this service for decades. The ring had come from Wichita 3 weeks later, a simple gold band that Graham had commissioned before the wedding with a note that said he was sorry it was late and he hoped it was right. It was exactly right. She wore it for the rest of her life. The winter of that year passed in the quiet fullness of a household that had become genuinely itself. Two people learning the particular and sometimes surprising work of being married to each other, the small adjustments and discoveries of shared daily life. They argued twice in those first months, once about the management of the cattle in the north pasture during a cold snap, which was a disagreement about facts that resolved itself when Graham's approach proved right, and he had the decency to explain why without rubbing it in, and once about something so small and so domestic that they would both later have difficulty remembering exactly what it had been, except that it had made her laugh in the middle of it, and then it was over. In the spring, Lavinia wrote a long letter to Graham's mother in Missouri, introducing herself and explaining how they had come to be married with the full and honest account that a woman who had been welcomed into a family without the chance to first be assessed by that family's matriarch owed her. She had labored over that letter for 3 evenings, crossing out and rewriting in the margins, until Graham had sat across from her and said, "She is going to love you. Write whatever is true." The reply, when it came, had been written in the precise, typeset quality hand he had described, and it had been warm and practical, and had concluded with a paragraph that said that any woman who had the courage and good sense to manage Graham's accounts and plant a kitchen garden in Kansas in her first month, there was exactly the sort of person the family had been hoping he would find, and that she hoped to meet her in person as soon as it could be arranged. Clara, the rancher's wife's sister, had written a separate note on the back of the same page, which said simply, "He has been terrible at letters for 3 years, which means he has been happy. Thank you." Lavinia had folded both letters and put them in the box she had acquired to hold the important papers of her life, alongside her parents' marriage certificate and her father's handwriting in an old ledger she had saved from the ranch before everything was taken, and she had felt the particular complicated warmth of a person who has lost one family and found another. The spring brought work and new cattle and the resumption of the kitchen garden, now expanded by 1/3 of its original size because the first season's results had been so satisfying. It also brought a visit from the Wichita attorney Graham had spoken with months before, a man named Aldous Hatch, who was passing through the area on business and stopped at the dryfall to deliver the news in person that the proceedings against Clement Ford in Amarillo had resulted in a significant judgment against him, and that a portion of the seized assets from his lending operation, including funds that could be traced to the forced sale of several ranch properties, were to be redistributed to the people from whom they had been wrongly taken. Lavinia had been in the kitchen when Hatch arrived, and Graham had called her to the parlor to hear this news, and she had sat very still through Hatch's precise, legal account of what had happened. When he finished, she had asked several careful questions about the process and the timeline and the likelihood of successful distribution, and Hatch had answered each one with growing appreciation for the quality of the inquiry. And at the end, he had said that he expected her share of the redistribution to be sufficient to repurchase some portion of her father's original land, if she wished to pursue that. She had thanked him and seen him off and come back inside and stood for a moment in the kitchen with her hands braced on the counter, and Graham had come to stand behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she had said very quietly he would have been glad to hear it. He would, Graham said. She had stood up straight and turned to look at him and said, "I do not want to go back to Texas. My life is here, but I would like to do something with that money that he would have understood." What would he have understood? Building something, she said, something real. They had talked about it for several evenings, and the conversation had ranged across possibilities with the spacious, unhurried quality of people who are not under pressure and can therefore think clearly. And what had emerged from those conversations was a plan to expand the dryfall substantially, to add the dairy operation Graham had been contemplating, to improve the bunkhouse for the hands, and to put a portion aside for the education fund that Lavinia wanted to establish for the children of the neighboring ranch families, because she had grown up understanding the specific value of a good education for a woman in a world that did not automatically provide it, and she intended to do something about that where she could. It was a good summer, a very good summer. The cattle were healthy and the markets were favorable, and the kitchen garden produced with an abundance that required the invention of new ways to preserve things, and the evenings were long and golden and full of the particular pleasure of a life that was working, that was built on real ground and growing in the right direction. In the late summer, Lavinia realized she was expecting a child. She had told Graham on a Sunday morning, not with drama, but with the directness she brought to everything, sitting across from him at the breakfast table with the summer light coming through the window and the sound of the ranch waking up around them. And the expression on his face when she told him had been one she would carry with her always. The complete, undefended joy of a person receiving the exact news they had not known they had been hoping for. He had reached across the table and taken both her hands in his and held them, and he had said, with a simplicity that was everything, "Are you well?" Not excitement first. Not the announcement or the plans or any of the dozen responses she might have expected. "Are you well?" Just as he had asked her name first before anything else. She had laughed because the consistency of the man was one of the great pleasures of loving him. "I am very well," she had said. "Good," he had said. And then a beat later the joy fully arriving. "A child." "A child," she had confirmed. He had been careful and attentive through the months that followed in a way that was not fussy or overprotective, but simply present. The way he was present for all things that mattered, with a steady, reliable attention that asked regularly what she needed, and then provided it without making a performance of the provision. She had kept working, because she was healthy and the work suited her and the ranch needed her, and she had adjusted what she did as her body required it, and Graham had adjusted with her without comment. Eli Voss had been told and had responded with his characteristic economy, saying, "Congratulations," in a voice that managed to convey considerable warmth within a single word, and then had gone about the business of quietly ensuring that no one asked Lavinia to carry anything heavier than a water pitcher for the rest of the year. The Creel brothers had received the news with an enthusiasm that resulted in Pete designing and building, with assistance from Orrin, a wooden cradle that was so beautifully made and so obviously the product of sustained effort that Lavinia had looked at it when it appeared in the parlor one morning and felt genuinely moved. "Pete made the rails," Orrin had said. "I did the joinery." "It is beautiful," Lavinia had said. Orrin had nodded once. "It should be built to last," he had said. "You'll probably need it more than once," which was both practical and touching and very much the Creel brothers at their finest. The child arrived in the spring, which was exactly the right time of year for it, and it was a boy, born healthy and vocal on a clear April morning with the whole ranch quietly alert to the event. And Graham had been there, holding her hand through the long hours of it with the same steady, dependable presence he brought to everything in life. And when the baby arrived and the midwife who had ridden out from the nearest town placed the child in Lavinia's arms and said he was fine and healthy and strong, Graham had looked at his son with an expression that made Lavinia's chest ache with the size of what she felt. "What do we call him?" Graham had asked. Lavinia had looked at the small, astonishingly actual face of her son for a long moment. "Elias," she had said. "After my father." Graham had said without hesitation, "Elias Haskins." "Yes." The ranch hand Sam Holt, who was the first of the men to be told, had reported back to the others in the bunkhouse, and the resulting celebration had been audible from the main house, which would have been more disruptive if Lavinia had not been so entirely pleased by it. Elias Haskins grew with the unreasonable speed of healthy children, and the dryfall grew with him. The dairy operation added in the fall of his first year. The bunkhouse improved the following spring. The education fund established in Elias' second year in coordination with 2 neighboring ranches whose owners had children of their own, and had responded to the proposal with immediate enthusiasm. The fund had been formally named the Whitaker Educational Fund, because Lavinia had said that if it was going to carry a name it would carry her father's name, and Graham had agreed entirely. And the first year it had provided books and a hired teacher for 12 children across 3 ranch properties, and the second year it had grown to 22 children. And by the time Elias was old enough to be one of its beneficiaries, it had become a recognized institution in that part of Kansas. The kind of small, stubborn, necessary thing that changes the texture of a place without requiring any official permission to do so. Graham's mother, Harriet Haskins, had made the journey from Missouri in the spring of Elia's second year, traveling with Clara and her husband on the train to Wichita and then by wagon to the dry fall. And the meeting between Harriet and Lavinia had been everything Graham had predicted and more. Harriet was a woman in her 60s with the precise handwriting made physical, a sharp, observant intelligence and a warmth that was entirely genuine. And she had looked at the dry fall and at the accounts, and at the kitchen garden and at Elia's, and at her son's face when he looked at his wife. And she had taken Lavinia's hands in hers on the second morning and said, "He wrote me about you, before the auction, before any of it. He said he had encountered a woman in Caldwell who had more dignity and good sense than anyone he had met in Kansas, and that he was going to try to help." She had pressed Lavinia's hands. "I told Clara then that he was in love, and he did not even know it yet." Lavinia had laughed and felt tears at the same time, which was a combination she had become more willing to allow since Elias was born, some door in her having opened that she had previously kept carefully shut. "He asked my name first," she said. Harriet had nodded. "I raised him to do that," she said. "Always the name first. A person's name is their first dignity." Clara's husband, a solid, good-humored man named Robert who had clearly been deeply happy with Clara for a decade, and showed no signs of declining on this point, had spent most of the visit in useful and productive conversation with Eli Voss about cattle management, which both men found entirely more interesting than any social niceties, and this had suited everyone. Me, the youngest sister, now 19 and full of the opinions Graham had described, had written a letter saying she could not make the trip but planned to come the following year, and the letter had been so long and so funny and so stuffed with questions about Lavinia's kitchen garden and the Kansas weather, and what Elias looked like that Lavinia had read it twice and written back 4 pages. The second child came in the 4th year of the marriage, a girl this time, born in the heat of August with less drama than Elias but no less joy, and they named her Ruth, for Graham's mother's mother, whose name they had discussed on one of those long evening conversations and agreed was both beautiful and good. Ruth Haskins came into the world with the particular calm self-possession of a person who has already decided that things are going to be fine, and this quality did not change as she grew, only deepened. And she and her brother were such different and complementary personalities that watching them together was one of the daily pleasures of the dry fall. The years built on each other with the satisfying solidity of good construction, each one adding something to the structure without requiring the previous ones to be rebuilt. The dry fall grew into one of the better-regarded ranches in the region, known for the quality of its cattle and the fairness of its operations, and the particular hospitality of its main house, where travelers who needed a meal and a place to rest could always count on both. Graham was named to the territory's Cattlemen's Association in the 5th year, and Lavinia had attended the meeting with him as a matter of course, and the fact that she participated fully in the business discussions, and that her understanding of the account structures of the region's cattle operations was more thorough than most of the men in the room had been noted by enough of those men, that by the second meeting she had been asked directly for her assessment of a particular contract dispute. And she had given it with the directness and clarity that was her way, and the dispute had been resolved on the basis of her analysis in a way that served everyone fairly. She did not think of this as exceptional. She thought of it as the entirely logical result of being competent at a thing that needed doing. But she understood, without being sentimental about it, that it mattered that it was possible, that the small territory of possibility she occupied had been purchased in part by standing on a platform in Caldwell with her chin up and refusing to let anyone convince her that her value was less than what she knew it to be, and in part by a man who had asked her name before he asked anything else. It was in the 7th year that a letter arrived from Caldwell with the news that Deacon Pruitt had died in prison, where he had been serving the sentence arising from his fraudulent proceedings. The letter was from Aldous Hatch, who had taken a professional interest in the case and continued to follow it, and he noted that this concluded the last open thread of that matter in his professional view. Lavinia had read the letter and set it down and thought about what she felt. She did not feel joy exactly, which would have been uncharitable and not quite honest. She felt something that was more like the quiet closing of a door that had been standing open for a long time, not with relief and not with satisfaction, but with a kind of tired acknowledgement that some things do, eventually, resolve. She had told Graham, and he had read the letter and set it down, and he had said, "Is that finished then?" "Yes," she had said. "That is finished." They had said nothing more about it and had gotten on with the day, which was a normal ranch day full of normal ranch things, and Lavinia had thought that this was exactly right, that the final disposition of a man who had tried to use the machinery of power against her should take up no more of their days than this, and that the life going on all around her, the horses in the paddock and the children in the yard and the kitchen garden and the accounts, and the husband who was at that moment visible through the window, talking to Eli Voss with the unhurried ease of two people who have been working together a long time, was the more accurate and more important thing. Elias, at 7, had a particular passion for the horses, which Lavinia understood completely and encouraged, and Graham had begun teaching him the basics of riding and care with the patient, systematic attention he brought to teaching anything. And the sight of the two of them in the paddock together, Graham's hand on Elias' small back as the boy sat straight on a gentle quarter horse, was something Lavinia stored in the particular part of herself that held the things she most wanted to keep. Ruth, at 3, was firmly attached to Eli Voss, which Eli managed with a dignity that was slightly undermined by the expression on his face whenever she presented him with something she had found interesting, a rock or a feather or a piece of the leather fringe from one of the work gloves, and said, "For you," with the absolute assurance of a person giving a magnificent gift. He kept everything she gave him on the windowsill of the bunkhouse, which the Creel brothers observed without comment. The Education Fund had, by the 8th year of the Dry Falls operation under this form, provided schooling to over 60 children in the surrounding area, and the teacher they employed, a young woman named Miss Josephine Farrell from Ohio, who had come west with the same practical determination Lavinia recognized in herself, had established a school in the nearest town with the backing of 3 ranch families and a subscription from the Wichita newspaper that had written a short piece about it. Lavinia had attended the opening of the school and stood in the back of the room and listened to the first lesson, 20 children in wooden chairs with their slates ready, and she had felt her father there, not in any mystical sense, but in the simple sense that good work remembers the people who first believed in it. And Elias Whitaker had believed, as deeply as he believed in anything, that his daughter's mind was worth something, and here was the evidence that he had been right. She had told Graham about this on the ride home, and he had listened and said, he would be proud. He would be noisy about it, she said, with the particular smile she reserved for the memories of her father's magnificent, undignified laugh. He would tell everyone he met. Good, Graham said. It deserves to be told. A 3rd child came in the 9th year, a boy they named James, after no one in particular except that it was a name they had both always liked, a solid, unpretentious name that suited the solid, unpretentious person James turned out to be. He was born in March with the air of a person arriving at a place he intended to stay, and the household absorbed him as households absorb children who are waited for and wanted, with complete and unconscious ease. Elias, at 9, was serious about his new brother's arrival in the way that oldest children are serious about such things, which meant both a genuine tender attentiveness and an equally genuine occasional resentment of the distraction. And the navigation of these competing feelings was one of the small ongoing dramas of the household that Lavinia observed with the interest and occasional amusement of a person who had read widely enough about human nature to recognize its patterns. Ruth, at 5, had no conflicted feelings whatsoever. James was hers. This was established on the first day and maintained without revision. The 10th year brought something Lavinia had not entirely expected, which was that the life she had built from the wreckage of everything that had been taken from her was not merely a replacement for what had been lost, but something distinctly and specifically itself, something that could not have been predicted from any of its components, that was more than the sum of the land and the work and the children and the man at the center of it. She was standing in the kitchen on an ordinary October morning, the same month she had come to the dryfall a decade before, with the smell of the cooling season coming through the window and the sound of James on the floor behind her, engaged in the systematic destruction of a small stack of blocks, and Elia's voice from outside calling something to his father, and the particular quality of light that October in Kansas produced, that clean, gold, significant light, and she had been aware, completely and without reservation, that this was it. This was what it was supposed to feel like, this specific accumulation of ordinary things. This was the thing her father had been building and Clement Ford had tried to take, and Deacon Prout had tried to use against her, and the man who had asked her name first had helped to make possible. She had stood there for a moment in the full presence of this knowledge, and then she had heard Graham come in through the back door, the specific sound of his boots on the kitchen floor, and she had turned, and he had looked at her with the expression he wore when he knew she was thinking something worth hearing, attentive and unhurried. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am very glad you asked my name first," she said. He had looked at her for a moment, and something in his face had softened in the way it still did after 10 years, when she said something that reached directly through all the practical daily business of living to the thing underneath it. "So am I," he said. He had crossed the kitchen and kissed her in the morning light, while James disrupted the blocks behind them with great satisfaction, and it had been simple and good and exactly right. And then he had said that Eli needed a word about the north pasture fence, and she had said the coffee was ready when he was done, and he had gone back out, and she had turned to the stove, and the ordinary morning of the Dryfall Ranch continued its ordinary business on the Kansas plain in October of 1888. With the grass going gold, and the sky enormous, and 3 children growing strong and fast in the particular freedom of a life built on honest ground. In the spring of that 11th year, Haskins, now 30 and still full of opinions, had finally made her long-promised visit, traveling from Missouri with a young schoolteacher named Daniel who had the slightly dazed expression of a man who had recently agreed to something larger than he had initially understood, and was discovering that it was exactly the right size after all. Graham had welcomed his sister with a warmth that was everything Lavinia had expected from a man whose love of family was one of the things she had loved about him first, and had thrown her arms around Lavinia's neck within 10 minutes of arriving and said, in her ear, "He is so much better since you. You have no idea." Lavinia had held her tight and said, "I have some idea." The visit had lasted 3 weeks, which was exactly long enough for me and Lavinia to become genuine friends rather than simply sisters by marriage, bonded by the particular female frankness of women who are not performing for anyone and have decided to trust each other on the basis of what they observe rather than what they are told. They had talked about everything, about Daniel, about Missouri, about the school Lavinia had helped build, about me's own plans which were considerable and still forming, and about their shared experience of being women who had been told in various ways and by various means that their ambitions were larger than the space they were permitted, and what you did about that. What you did about that, they agreed, was you found the right ground, prepared it carefully, planted what you had, and then you tended it every day with the serious intention of someone who knows that good things do not grow without attention and do not survive without protection. And you did not stop being angry about the injustice of needing to do all that when other people simply inherited their space without question. But you did not let the anger become the thing you were doing instead of the work. Had listened to all of this with the focused attention of a person storing information for immediate use, and Daniel had listened too, with the expression of someone taking notes he could not afford to lose. After they left, Graham had asked what they had talked about, and Lavinia had given him an honest summary, and he had listened with the complete attention that was one of the qualities she had loved about him for 11 years, and when she finished he had said, "You should write it down." "Write what down?" "What you know about building something real," he said. "The accounts, the fund, the school, all of it. There are women who are where you were in Caldwell who would benefit from knowing that it is possible to get from there to here." She had looked at him. "You think so?" "I know so," he said. She had thought about it for several days, as she thought about all serious proposals, with the patient, systematic attention she gave to things that mattered. And then one evening she had sat down at the desk in the accounts room and taken a clean sheet of paper and begun writing, and it had come with a naturalness that told her it had been waiting for exactly this permission. She wrote about her father. She wrote about the ranch in Texas and the drought, and what happened when a system of power is used against people who cannot defend themselves. She wrote about Caldwell and the auction and the particular quality of standing on a platform and refusing to let fear show in your face, and about what it meant that the first thing the man who helped her had asked was her name. She wrote about the dry fall and the accounts and the garden and the education fund, and she wrote about what she had learned, which was not a list of instructions but something more like a report from a specific location. "Here is what it looks like from here. Here is what I know about the ground." She wrote it over 3 months in the evenings and the early mornings, and when it was done Graham had read it in one sitting and looked up at her with an expression that was everything, and said simply, "Yes, this is it." She had sent a copy to me, who had written back in a letter that was 3 times her normal length and which ended with a sentence that said, "I am having Daniel read this to his students." She had kept a copy in the box with her mother's Bible and her father's ledger, and her wedding letter from Harriet and the letter from the territorial marshal, and all the other documents of a life that had been built from what had been left after everything else was taken, and she had put the lid on the box with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has said what needed saying. The dry fall went on. The children grew. Elias became, at 12, the serious and capable young horseman you could see from the beginning he was going to be, already thinking about the horses with the systematic passion that in another decade would make him one of the region's more respected breeders. Ruth at 10 was in Miss Josephine Farrell's school and had opinions about history and mathematics and the correct way to do almost everything, which Lavinia found both familiar and extremely entertaining. James at 2 was James, solid and certain and entirely himself, with a laugh that was too big for him, a joyful, undignified sound that he produced without embarrassment, and every time she heard it Lavinia thought of her father. Graham at 42 was the same man he had been at 31 in all the ways that mattered, steady and direct and fundamentally decent in a way that did not require performance or announcement, and different in all the ways that years and love and children and work and shared life make a person different, deeper in some places and easier in others, carrying the specific knowledge of a person who has spent a long time doing something real and doing it well. On the evening of their 12th anniversary, he had brought her a book from Wichita, a new novel she had mentioned wanting, and a small bunch of the late-season prairie flowers that still grew along the dry creek that gave the ranch its name, and he had set both on the kitchen table in front of her without ceremony, and she had looked at the flowers and the book, and at the man who had brought them, and the feeling was as large and specific and entirely ungeneralizable as it had ever been. As it had been in the beginning when she had stood on a platform and heard him ask her name, and as it would continue to be, she knew, for as long as there was ground beneath them and sky above them and all of this life stretching forward into the good and spacious future. "Thank you," she said. "Happy anniversary," he said. 12 years, she said. 12 years, he said, with the particular satisfaction of a man who is counting something that keeps being worth counting. She had picked up the prairie flowers and held them and looked at him, and she had thought, as she had thought so many times in the years that had brought her from a platform in Caldwell to this kitchen table, that the world was full of men who would have asked different questions first, and that she had been found by the one who knew to ask the right one, and that this, more than anything else, was the thing she would always return to. He had asked her name, before anything else. Before her value or her usefulness or her history or her trouble. Just her name, as if the most important thing was simply who she was. And who she was, Lavinia Whitaker Haskins, daughter of Elias, wife of Graham, mother of Elias and Ruth and James, keeper of accounts and builder of schools and teller of necessary truths, had turned out to be exactly enough, and then some, and still growing. The dry creek in the north pasture would fill again in the spring, as it always did, twice a year without fail, the water finding the low places and running through them with the unhurried certainty of something that has been doing this long enough to know the way. And the grass on the Kansas plain would come up green again after the winter, and the sky would be enormous and indifferent and beautiful, and the Dry Fall Ranch would be there under it. Solid and real and alive with the particular life of people who have built something true together, and the children would grow and the horses would run, and the accounts would balance and the story would go on. And all of it, every last particular of it, would have started with a man walking out of a crowd and asking a woman her name.